to fight.
I will be back. No.
Welcome to the future.
In December 2022, Dan Foster, a biology teacher and former Green Beret, is giving a phone interview for a lab researcher position, hoping his military background and current job will help him secure the role. Afterward, he returns home to a Christmas party and asks his daughter, Muri, to help him carry the groceries inside. He steps out to finish the call but is disheartened to learn that someone else has been hired. Despite the disappointment, he joins Muri to watch the World Cup on TV. As they enjoy the game, a strange event unfolds. During the match, a glowing cloud of smoke appears on the field. From it emerge armed soldiers led by Lieutenant Hart, who announces they are from the year 2051. Humanity, she explains, is on the brink of extinction due to an alien invasion by creatures known as the White Spikes. She appeals for people to travel to the future to join the fight. Over the following months, nations worldwide send soldiers to 2051, but few return alive. As the trained soldiers dwindle, governments begin drafting civilians. One day, while teaching a disinterested class, Dan chats with a student named Martin, who is fascinated by volcanoes. Their conversation is interrupted by a notification on Dan's phone. He has been drafted into the war. At a military office, Dan learns he is eligible for conscription because he is destined to die in 7 years. Shocked and full of questions, he receives vague answers from the officers, who attach a tracking device to his arm. The device, they explain, will assist him in the future and cannot be removed until he completes his tour in 2051. That evening, Dan confides in his wife, Emmy, about the draft. Distraught, she suggests fleeing, but Dan points out the device on his arm tracks his every move. With nowhere to hide, Emmy suggests Dan visit his estranged father, James. A skilled engineer with a deep distrust of the government, James would never alert the authorities. It's revealed that James abandoned the family after returning from the Vietnam War, unable to cope with the trauma and violence he endured. This left a lasting scar on Dan, fueling resentment toward his father. Reluctantly, Dan meets James in an aircraft hangar a few hours later. Their conversation turns sour, escalating into an argument. Enraged, Dan walks out, telling his father never to send letters to Muri again. Left with no other choice, Dan prepares for enlistment. At home, he finds Muri playing in the backyard. Attempting to conceal the truth, he claims he's going on a trip, but Muri immediately realizes he's been drafted. Dan promises her he'll return and hugs her tightly before leaving. The next day, Dan and other rookies undergo training in weaponry and first aid to improve their survival chances. During this, he meets Charlie, an environmental scientist, and Dorian, a former Navy SEAL. While most fear the draft, Dorian is on his third deployment. They learn that the White Spikes vanish every 6 days to rest. New recruits are sent to the future during this period, while returning soldiers are brought back to their timeline. That evening, alarms blare through the facility. Young soldiers from 2051 scream that it's not a drill, and chaos erupts as everyone rushes toward the portal room. Dan confronts Lieutenant Hart, who gravely explains that the last research facility is under attack. Its loss would doom the war effort. Minutes later, the recruits enter the portal room. As they're pulled into the portal, a malfunction in the coordinates causes a catastrophic error. Dan and the others are teleported high in the sky. Most plummet to their deaths, but Dan, Charlie, and Dorian land in a rooftop swimming pool atop a skyscraper. Emerging from the water, Dan checks his weapon and surveys the ruined city of Miami. As the military investigates the time jump error, the Chief Command contacts the survivors. Dan responds to the Chief Command, who informs him of an imminent bombing to clear out the overwhelming number of White Spikes in the area. Before that happens, Dan is tasked with leading a combat search and rescue operation to save stranded scientists in a nearby building surrounded by White Spikes. He confirms the mission and quickly regroups the survivors on the rooftop. The team cautiously makes its way to the building, aware of the danger. The Chief Command warns them that White Spikes can detect blood from miles away. Upon entering, they find the scientists, but it's too late. They are already dead. The mission shifts to recovering hard drives and biosamples from the lab. As Dan secures the vials, an urgent update comes through. Fighter jets are en route to bomb the area in 6 minutes. Rushing to the emergency stairway, the team is ambushed by White Spikes descending from above. Dan struggles against one of the creatures until Dorian steps in, revealing their weak points, the neck and belly. With just 3 minutes left before the airstrike, rescue vehicles arrive. Relieved, the soldiers believe they're safe, but their hopes are dashed when a swarm of White Spikes attacks, obliterating the vehicles. Amid the chaos, 2 soldiers soldiers sacrifice themselves to delay the creatures, giving the remaining team a chance to escape. With the bombing underway, Dan and 4 others narrowly make it out alive. The next day, Dan wakes up at a military base in the Caribbean alongside Charlie. They reunite with Dorian and learn that only the 3 of them survived. Dan is summoned to meet the head of the Chief Command. To his astonishment, the leader is Colonel Murray Forrester, his daughter. Pride swells in Dan as he realizes her achievements, but Murray clarifies that his presence in 2051 is not for a family reunion. She cryptically hints at a critical task he must help her with, describing it as the most significant event in human history. She refuses to elaborate further. Murray leads Dan to a military tent, where she explains they have developed a toxin that kills male white spikes. To create one effective against females, they need to capture a live female for study. On the way to a white spike nest, Murray reveals that the creatures appeared mysteriously in northern Russia, spreading globally without any evidence of a crash site or extraterrestrial arrival. When Dan asks about their family's future, Murray avoids the topic, suggesting it's best left undiscussed. Soon, they arrive at the nest, where soldiers are attempting to trap a cornered female white spike in a cage. Everything seems under control until the female white spike breaks free, unleashing chaos. From the helicopter, Dan spots a horde of male white spikes closing in on the nest. Acting quickly, he and Murray slide down and manage to secure the female in a cage. As the helicopter lifts off with its volatile cargo, the horde arrives, forcing Dan and Murray to flee to a military vehicle. Fighting their way through the swarm, they escape and eventually stop at a beach to wait for another helicopter. Murray, visibly upset, confronts Dan about his recklessness, emphasizing how critical it is for him to stay alive. Her frustration spills into a revelation about their family's future. She explains that, after returning from the 2051 war, Dan became disillusioned with life, divorced Emmy, and lived as a recluse. On her 16th birthday, she received a devastating call. Dan had died in an accident. The revelation leaves Dan shaken, horrified at the thought that he became the very person he had vowed never to emulate, his estranged father. Soon, they arrive at the military base, where Murray leads Dan to her lab. There, she is tirelessly synthesizing a toxin to eliminate the female white spikes. Time is critical. Dan has only 21 hours before being sent back to his timeline. The following morning, Dan returns to the lab and questions Murray about her deployment plan. She explains that the military in 2051 is depleted and can no longer sustain the fight. Her goal is for Dan to take the toxin back to his time, mass produce it, and stop the war from ever happening. As they talk, the computer announces a breakthrough. The latest test yields a perfect result. Murray has found the toxin, but before they can celebrate, the captured female awakens, emitting a piercing call that draws hordes of white spikes to the base. The breach is swift and catastrophic. Dan and Murray grab their weapons and fight their way toward the helipad. Cornered multiple times, they struggle to stay ahead of the onslaught. With just 3 minutes left before the time jumpers are sent back, an injured Murray hands Dan the vial containing the toxin. Before they can escape, a white spike attacks. Its massive weight causes the floor to collapse, sending it and Murray sliding toward the edge. Desperate, Dan leaps after his daughter, but just as he reaches out, he is teleported back to his own timeline midair. Dan wakes up holding the vial, his mission in 2051 complete. Later, he informs Lieutenant Hart that they must mass-produce the toxin and send it back in time. However, she delivers devastating news. The time portal has been destroyed from the future's side. There is no way to send anything or anyone back. Dan heads home, immediately embracing his daughter with relief and gratitude. That night, he confides in Emmy, recounting his extraordinary meeting with Murray in the future. He also reveals the mystery surrounding the white spikes. They seemingly appeared out of nowhere in 2048. When Emmy suggests they might have landed on Earth years earlier, a sudden idea sparks in Dan's mind. The scene shifts to a bar where Dan sits with Dorian, discussing their shared experiences from the future. Determined to prevent the war, they decide to investigate further. Using the white spike claw that Dorian wears as a necklace, they seek out Charlie, an environmental scientist. Charlie examines the claw and discovers traces of volcanic ash from China, a puzzling finding since the white spikes first emerged in northern Russia, not China. The trio then heads to Dan's biology classroom to consult Martin, a student with an obsession for volcanoes. When asked how a creature from Russia could have Chinese volcanic ash on its claws, Martin explains that the ash likely originated from the Changbai mountain eruption 1,000 years ago. This massive eruption in northern China scattered ash that eventually settled in icebergs in northern Russia. Realization dawns on the group. The white spikes likely arrived on Earth a millennium ago, becoming trapped in the ice until global warming began to melt it, leading to their emergence in 2048. Using a simulation, they confirmed their hypothesis. The melting ice sheets in Russia align perfectly with the timeline of the White Spike's attack. Armed with this knowledge, they propose a covert mission to the U.S. Air Force to locate and neutralize the threat. However, their request is denied due to strained relations between the U.S. and Russia. Undeterred, Dan turns to his father, James, who owns a collection of unregistered airplanes. James agrees to help, and the team, including Lieutenant Hart and a batch of newly produced toxins, sets out for Russia. After hours of travel, they arrive at the Academy of Glacier Sciences in northern Russia. Scouring the icy terrain, they discover an area where electronic devices mysteriously stop working. Suspecting they found the right location, the team sets explosives to breach the ground. The blast reveals the entrance to an ancient cavern. Cautiously descending into the icy depths, they come upon a shocking sight, a massive, frozen alien spaceship. They cut through the ice and cautiously enter the alien ship, leaving Charlie and James outside as a precaution in case anything tries to escape. As the team delves deeper into the vessel, they reach the cockpit and deduce that this is a crash site. The aliens on board never intended Earth to be their destination. Moving into another chamber, they discover the white spikes, dormant inside a series of biopods. The realization hits hard. These creatures were bioengineered weapons, designed by an advanced alien race to colonize other planets. Wasting no time, the team begins injecting the pods with the toxin. The white spikes wriggle and writhe in pain, confirming that the toxin works, but their screams awaken the uninfected creatures, which violently break out of their pods and attack. A fierce battle ensues, with the team shooting as many as they can. Despite their efforts, some creatures escape. In the chaos, Dorian makes a fateful decision. He declares that the only way to stop the remaining creatures is to destroy the entire ship. Handing Dan his treasured claw as a keepsake, Dorian stays behind to activate the bomb while the others escape. As they make their way out, the group is ambushed by the white spikes. Only Dan, Charlie, and James manage to reach safety before the ship is obliterated in the explosion. The blast destroys every creature inside, except for the Queen. Realizing the immense threat she poses, the team regroups to take her down. They decide to split up, employing a clever tactic. Dan constructs a snowman, disguising it with a jacket to mimic a human figure. The Queen White Spike, fooled by the ruse, descends to attack the decoy. As she lands, Dan and his team open fire, relentlessly shooting to weaken her. They push the Queen to the edge of a cliff and send her tumbling down. But the formidable beast refuses to be defeated. She climbs back up, her resilience a terrifying display of her strength. In the ensuing chaos, the Queen's ferocious attack forces Dan and James to separate. From a distance, she fires a spike at Dan, then lunges toward him with deadly intent. However, Dan uses that same spike to injure the Queen's mouth while James tears out one of her eyes. The creature is now blind and begins thrashing around in desperation. Dan takes this opportunity to inject the toxin into her leg, but to his utter horror, the creature is intelligent enough to amputate her own leg before the toxin can spread. At this crucial moment, James raises his wounded hand to make the alien smell and come after him. But Dan refuses to let his father sacrifice himself and jumps on the Queen, injures the spike's throat with Dorian's claw, and inserts the last vial of toxin in her mouth before kicking her down the cliff again. This causes the Queen Spike to crash against a big rock and finally die. The next day, newscasts all over the world report an explosion in Russia that eliminated a bunch of aliens. The government tries to take credit for the whole operation. In the meantime, Dan returns home and reunites with his family. He also puts all the resentment aside and embraces his father. And with that, this story ends here. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like our channel and subscribe if you enjoy content like this. Also, let us know what movie you would love us to recap for you.